The war with Iran may be entering a completely different phase. President Donald Trump is now warning that countries helping Iran could themselves face major economic consequences. Not just Iranian companies, not just Iranian banks, potentially other countries. And that immediately creates one enormous question. What happens if Washington tries to force countries such as China to choose between doing business with Iran and maintaining access to the American economy? Because this could turn a Middle East war into something far larger, a global economic confrontation. Trump issued the warning late Wednesday. He said countries allowing their financial institutions, businesses, airports, or government entities to provide what he described as a lifeline to Iran could face severe economic consequences. He also promised economic isolation on what he described as an unprecedented scale. But there is an important detail. Washington has not yet explained exactly what that means. Trump did not announce a specific new tariff. He did not publish a list of targeted countries. And he did not specify whether the punishment would take the form of sanctions, tariffs, banking restrictions, or some combination of those tools. So today's announcement is a threat. The next question is how Washington intends to enforce it. If Washington seriously wants to cut Iran off from foreign revenue, it cannot avoid China. China is Iran's dominant oil customer. Reuters, citing Kepler data, reports that China buys more than 80% of Iran's shipped oil. Much of that trade involves independent Chinese refiners rather than the country's biggest state oil companies. These refiners have historically been attracted to discounted Iranian crude, while Beijing has rejected unilateral U.S. sanctions as a basis for determining its trade policy. Washington has already sanctioned entities linked to Iranian oil shipments into China. But a much more aggressive campaign could go further. Reuters reported earlier this week that possible U.S. options include targeting additional Chinese refiners or financial institutions involved in Iranian transactions. Such moves could also trigger retaliation from Beijing, and that is where this story could become explosive. Such moves could also trigger retaliation from Beijing, and that is where this story could become explosive. One important Iranian commercial connection has already been cut. The economic significance is substantial. The UAE says the decision followed renewed missile fire that it attributed to Iran. Iran has rejected the UAE's account of those launches. For years, the Emirates has functioned as an important trading and re-export hub for Iranian businesses. Businesses seeking goods, financial connections, and access to international commerce. AP notes that this role helped Iran absorb some of the impact of previous sanctions. Closing that door increases Tehran's isolation. But trying to close every door is much harder. The United States has a powerful economic weapon that does not require attacking another country directly. It can pressure companies outside Iran by threatening their access to American markets or financial systems. These are often called secondary sanctions. Imagine a foreign bank doing business with Iran. Washington can effectively tell that bank, continue processing Iranian transactions, and you may lose access to American financial networks. For many international companies, that is an ugly choice. Iran may be valuable, but access to U.S. markets, banks, and dollars can be far more valuable. Washington has already used secondary sanctions against buyers and facilitators of Iranian oil. Trump's latest statement suggests the administration may be considering expanding that logic significantly. Supporters of tougher sanctions argue that Iran's economy is already under enormous pressure, and that cutting additional trade routes could force Tehran back toward an agreement. Washington says economic pressure can reduce the revenue Iran uses to sustain its military and nuclear programs. But there is another side. Iran has lived under extensive American sanctions for decades. Sanctions can damage an economy without necessarily forcing the political outcome Washington wants. And targeting large economies such as China creates additional risks. China could retaliate against U.S. companies. Trade tensions could rise. Supply chains could become more expensive. Countries might also look for ways to conduct transactions outside traditional American-controlled financial channels. The more countries Washington threatens simultaneously, the more complicated enforcement becomes. 3 scenarios now matter. The first is compliance. More countries follow the UAE, reduce trade with Iran, and avoid the risk of American punishment. Iran becomes increasingly isolated. The second is confrontation. China and other countries continue trading with Tehran. Washington begins imposing secondary sanctions or other economic penalties. Beijing retaliates. And suddenly, the Iran conflict becomes intertwined with the already complicated U.S. China economic relationship. Then there is the diplomatic route. The threat becomes leverage rather than policy. Washington and Tehran return to negotiations. Sanctions pressure becomes part of the bargaining process, and some restrictions are eventually exchanged for Iranian concessions. We do not yet know which route Trump intends to take, and that uncertainty matters, because markets can price a sanction. It is much harder to price a threat with no defined boundary. For months, the Iran conflict has been fought with missiles, warships, blockades, and sanctions. Now Washington is threatening to widen the economic battlefield. The biggest question may no longer be, can Iran survive American pressure? It may become, how many other countries is Washington willing to confront in order to isolate Tehran? It may become, how many other countries is Washington willing to confront in order to isolate Tehran? And if China is one of them, the consequences could travel far beyond the Middle East. This is Global Brief News, beyond the headlines.